Morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to kick off the day with the tech sessions, so thank you for making that in time. I'm Torsten. I want to take you through a journey into cloud and cloud transformation. And while we do that, we have a look on the role of the ADC that it has today and future-wise, and finding out what the actual difference is. In preparation of Synergy sessions, it's always the same hassle. You have an abstract of a session that you just create like a half a year earlier than the actual show starts, and you collect the things, get the story done right, and work on the chapters, and then you find out you have much more content that you actually can present for. I got a 45-minute slot assigned, and it turns out the original deck that I intended to give you here in that session is practically ready for like 70 or 80 or 90 minutes. So my plan is we just do the recording on the 45 minutes deck, which you see now, whereas in the upload section, where I get the deck later on for the organization, you get the full deck later on. You can compare which slides were being left out while I host the show right now. So if you look at the page numbering while moving forward, you will see that it is not truly incremental. We have some skips in there. So I would suggest when you have the recording later on in Citrix TV, sometimes do a pause and then look at the download, what's missing in between, because I just need to squeeze out certain things to be in the time frame. The idea why I'm here, it comes about like this. Why having a session about that? It is based on the customer feedback that I worked with over the last year, because every time you get into discussion about moving forward into cloud, a certain marketing machine comes along with that, right? It comes from the cloud CSPs and all the other offerings that come there, promoting you a certain readiness state of what is in their package, and that leaves behind some kind of impression that this is the end of the traditional ADC plays that we're working with over the years. And maybe there's also a fair question to ask if that changes the game at all. And that's the motivation why running that session. So first, talking about cloud transformation, if you think about your own journey there, about your own customers, for example, if you're a partner, everybody's different, and now everybody's claiming that because of cloud, everything is happening different than before. And the question is if that really is. And what I'd like to suggest in any political management debate that goes on when you move cloud is bringing up just a very simple statement like this. There is no cloud. Cloud is just a business model. It's just about technology. It's just another data center you select for running your services and your infrastructure across. Cloud is just the economic perspective of that. We talk about IT, we talk about technology, and talk about requirements, but while you go there, please make sure along the debate, are you talking about a services subscription, or are you talking about that you host your infrastructure in someone else's data center? Because that's just the two flavors that typically everybody has to run through and decide how to move forward his own setup and how this can be modernized over the course of time. Another aspect that you will easily find out when you do that journey, that this one cloud is not enough thing comes up. Not every cloud has the full features that you require, especially on the services tier. There are strong differences and differentiations. There is competition. There are alternates. And if you mix that together, you find out that you need to hold this all together. And putting things together is also a discipline that is important. What I also like is the statement that I often get heard, that this is also the end of the traditional perimeter in your existing IT infrastructure. Could be, but what's still remaining is an important question of who is in charge of identities. It's still your users, right? It's not an anonymous infrastructure that is just sitting there. It is something that is purpose-built for a certain user audience, and that is different per each user audience. So controlling identities and who has access to which side of information is important. Authentication becomes the ultimate important question. How do users authenticate the resources? What is under the hood? What is covered in front of the user? What is interactively displayed? And that's really important thing. So talking about the cloud, we need to compare our traditional infrastructure stack with at least two options that you can pursue. The first one in the middle is the traditional infrastructure tier, where you subscribe into someone else's data center services to host your VMs. And of course, it is giving up the asset and it's giving up portions of control in regarding to infrastructure. It goes even further if you think about platforms and services offerings, where you completely give up your own idea of how to operate IT and subscribe to a logical service instead. And if you compare your today's work, if you on the left-hand side, and work traditional IT, if you accept the terminology, ADC is living somewhere in between these two layers. And it's fair to say, if we take this picture as an example and move forward to the right, that there may be something different now because you don't own the whole stack anymore. So maybe you don't own these specific portions where traditionally an ADC was a perfect fit for because you no longer have that level of control, maybe, depending on what that is. It is go even more severe if you move further to the right-hand side. Obviously, there is something different. So this is maybe some of the reasons why the traditional notion comes up that ADC is now dead. And I would say it's at least dead from the very traditional perspective of working with ADC technology, but that doesn't necessarily mean it goes completely away. So drilling that down a bit, at least when the clicker is with me. Okay, here we go. It's undoubted that ADC has a strong competency on the infrastructure tier. So if you go in infrastructure as a service offerings on regardless cloud, being Azure, Google, or Amazon, whatever, you can subscribe to their infrastructure tier in terms of VMs, but that not necessarily means that you take the whole set from them. So these VMs is still something that you have to manage from the inside, so the operating system and the functionality is still yours. So maybe ADC is also something that is not something that is provided by the cloud service provider. It's still something that you have to maintain and operate there because you have existing infrastructure that is just moved over. We maybe are talking that lift and shift phenomenon, that going cloud not necessarily means that we take the existing IT puzzle and rethink any single component and invest into development and recreating modern applications and modern middleware and modern infrastructure. As I said, we're just uplifting traditional workloads. Remember what was in the keynote? You may have heard that on a side note. If the theory is accurate that by 90% of applications are still there in 4 years, the reason is pretty simple, because we're just doing lift and shift into cloud with traditional stuff. We're not recreating those things. And that's also a reason why this specifically is not a cloud-native session. I don't want to talk about Kubernetes and all that stuff. We're talking about traditional IT asset that you have today. The products that you own today in your data center that have to go kind of a cloud way. This is why that lift and shift comes back. And of course, moving further to the right, ADC on the identity tier is something that can complement the existing platform and services offerings in a tremendous difference. So it's easier to talk about all that picture as a puzzle. And I brought with me a puzzle, and that's actually the agenda for today. I've brought with me 2 different flavors of how to look at ADC technology when looking on a cloud transformation journey. The first one sits at the infrastructure perspective, and the second flavor comes from the identity perspective. And from a timing perspective, I was saying I will exceed any 45-minute session if you go further. I need to limit that to at least these 6 puzzle pieces, which is, I think, a good overall perspective of things that are important to talk about. So we talk about services, we talk about sites, we talk about a networking flavor. Brought something with me that is maybe unexpected to you. Let's get surprised on that. Of course, Azure AD takes a very important placeholder here, because that's the kind of the de facto standard that nobody can negate anymore, as it's running Windows stuff in a Windows shop. The Azure AD is just there, regardless if you like that or not. So it has actually 2 puzzle pieces to get that discussed. And we wouldn't be at Synergy not talking about Citrix WORKSPACE. And we have at least some new flavors in where I would place a bet that you have no clue about that is coming, because some of that actually just arrived last week. So let's go with that. First chapter, it's about the services. I really want to start the old school. I want to re-stress the old school services availability thing. So we're going down to the infrastructure tier and talking about availability for your services. And what is important if you move from your existing IT infrastructure into a cloud is the thing that is called uptime SLA. I think everybody of you has a certain infrastructure component in-house where management has decided that this component may not be touched during business hours and during weekdays, where the maintenance window is hard-coded, predefined to you, may work on that system on a Saturday afternoon and nobody else has a chance to get in there. If you imagine those disciplines and working with the SLA and uptime this way, and you go into a cloud service provider world, you will just screwed because they have also working hours, they have maintenance windows and stuff like that, so they simply ignore the fact that you might be uncomfortable if a system goes down during weekday, let's say at 2:00 p.m., if it's their maintenance window, because they have hundreds and thousands of customers, it's just their maintenance window. So you need to double check and take care what their concepts are in terms of this terminology like an update domain, a fault domain, availability zones, regions, and unfortunately all this terminology is different per each cloud service provider, so it's not easily to understand what the methodology they pursue to guarantee you uptime. The guarantee is not at the granular individual VM. The uptime guarantee is for the whole set that follows down their recommendations of how to build reliable services. So cloud service providers assume that you load balance practically everything, which is not the real reality where we come from today, but you need to keep that in mind when going forward down that road. So that's obviously the reason why load balancing technology is part of any service provider offering, right? You can subscribe to their functionality and make that happen. And you need to take care if you have single server deployments and how to deal with that. And if you put that into cloud, you need to remember, okay, how many clouds do I actually need? Is it running just in one? Is it more a sprawl of service locations where that ends up in? And the only answer, the very first result of thinking about that cloud transformation journey is that automation is fundamentally required to get that managed somehow. So it's about questioning the learning curve that you need to invest for to automate your existing traditional IT in those areas where automation has not taken place yet. You know, everybody has done some sort of automation already, but did you automate everything? I personally doubt. It's good if that is, but it's still a different thing if it goes cloud-wise. So thinking about that, and this is obviously an extreme example where I spread the service across many, many locations. Either pick 2 or 3 of them, and still a valid example. It's about a development cycle for a new version. It's about the life state on whatever site and place you want to run that. It may be located on a DR perspective. It can be a cloud perspective, and you need to push that out, right? So what happens if you have those services spread around certain areas and use every single available offering, you have a huge mix of availability options in there. You have kind of a low-end LB functionality for your dev stage because you need something. You maybe have a mature one in your primary production side. You maybe have something cloud-specific LB on their end just to get the HA quality there. And what you do there is some sort of engineering and obviously some sort of scripting all around these services. So it starts with the question if individual LB solutions per each place where you put services on is really the best way going forward. And the excuse that it costs you money putting something in there that has a product character is not the only perspective. All these scripting and all these maintenance things cost you money. It's even more expensive because it costs you people. It costs you stuff. So one perspective could be, in transitioning to the next slide, is unifying the load balancing technology and putting an ADC everywhere, which at least simplifies your scripting perspective because what you script on the inside on the load balancing is the same regardless of which side you select. So it looks like the best way that standardization is a fundamental counterpart and complementary selection to automation, right? But if you just stop at that layer, you're not saving any single dollar. It will become more expensive than everything what you did before because standardization is just the starting point. What you actually need, in transition to the next slide, is an orchestration solution. What you need to go for is you have your dev results where you create the required configuration and check that in kind of a template manner into an orchestration system that then acts on behalf of you and spreads that out to whatever target site is meant to be used for running that specific service. So what I'm saying is make this in this example, make this a Citrix problem of actually talking to specific clouds and pushing configurations and stuff in there, and don't waste the time on this infrastructure learning thing, but put more pressure on creating good templates. That saves you more money than actually any difference. So that's the first thing, how to rethink how services can be deployed. And by that, it brings back a certain argumentation line why ADC, even in a cloud infrastructure approach, is not completely dead per se. It's just a question which position you want to take on the total cost of ownership of maintaining HA services there. Assuming we did that right, it could still be a subject to failure, right? An HA service still can go down, so we need to talk about the sites phenomenon. Talking about sites means that standard LB is good for a region, but not necessarily something that allows you a good uptime when it has to cross certain geographical boundaries. And what I would recommend is that you rethink your services offering in the same way as CSPs do. they think in a multi-site approach because they also are aware of the fact that a certain site may go down for a certain reason over a certain point of time. And so what this brings you is a bunch of dependencies and a bunch of advantages. What I personally like is not only the independence that a certain cloud may go down for whatever reason, it brings you a simplified approach of versioning. When I see customers failing their upgrades on monolithic systems, it is because of the reason that you patch a certain monolithic system and the next time the user hits the system, everything has to be working. If you rethink your update philosophy in terms of sites and have a productive site and a backup site, for example, and you do versioning on the backup site first and then move users over there and test that out in terms of a canary deployment or just as a test phase, you have this forward and backward versioning option of just going easier forward when it comes to updating large monolithic applications. So this multi-site could also be a great opener for versioning concepts. And that means you need to think about how traffic routing actually works. You need to get your infrastructure ready so that users don't know what you do with sites. They just need to have access to a certain service, regardless of where it's located, and you need to take care of how the users get there. So from a graphics perspective, I would like to introduce a terminology like intelligent connection distribution mechanism. You need to find a way how users access the systems. In that very basic example, it's an active-passive site where the passive site is actually not ready to take traffic. And that requires that a certain component that is part of this connection distribution mechanism has awareness about the health state there. And if you compare traditional traffic routing from a cloud service provider standpoint and compare that with the service monitoring they can do on the ADC tier, the ADC is much more granular, actually knowing the whole uptime, the whole availability of the whole backend. So it's not only if a web server is up and down, you can also have probes towards the backend if the database is there, if the data actually is in a good state, and get that all together as a service health state and decide on where to route the user. So that allows you switching over users from an active to a passive site easier. And for active-passive deployments, that is pretty much the minimum set that you need, and you're good with that. What you obviously can do, you can manipulate the way that decision is made. So switching over users between site A and site B has never become easier if you have this routing mechanism on top of that. And of course, that's the old story when discussing ADC functionality. If you put together the load balancing functionality together with a traffic steering competency in just one instance, it gets obviously cheaper because you reuse the existing asset that you have there. That's always a good recommendation, not putting pinpoint ADCs somewhere because of the cost footprint, but instead combining features on a box if they logically make sense there. And that's something that you can do on that picture. So technically at that picture, it's not 4 ADCs, it's just still two pairs of them that can do the job. And that's still a very valid design phase. It becomes more interesting in transition to the next slide if we think about an active-active site, which is absolutely the way you want to go for better user quality, better resilience, which obviously needs you to solve the replication problem better than you may have today. That's the only thing where Citrix cannot help you at all, but that's okay. There are other solutions that can do so. And you still need a services availability. You take the existing things from the active-passive philosophy over to active-active, and that's working. And this is where the world has a little bit changed because of an acquisition that Citrix made. We talk about the thing that the global server load balancing knows about your backend best. That's no doubt. But what global server load balancing has no clue about is the overall traffic quality situation across the internet routing. That's the reason why that intelligent traffic metering comes into play, which allows you combining the quality of the traffic behavior in between client and your endpoints together with the health state that your own data center side or your cloud side actually has. And so it's about chaining these two functionalities. So if you are in an active-active world, rethinking your existing GSLB design in favor of adding ITM on top makes huge difference there in terms of user quality in case that those two sites span the globe. If they adjust in a single state, that's pretty easy. If they span continents like EMEA and Asia or EMEA, US or whatever, this really makes a difference that the traditional ADC GSLB per itself alone cannot do, but combining these two flavors together makes a huge difference there. Networking I've promised there comes something surprising in there. I would bring your attention into something very different. If you mix up clouds and if you mix up offerings, you obviously spray your services around, and you have multiple VMs running in multiple places, and you get that problem of IP routing, right? What is interesting to at least think about, and it's not a general purpose recommendation, but it's something that may help you in certain situations, is expanding your IP range, your existing IP range, into someone else's data center. That means we talk about network virtualized context where you bring your own IP into someone else's environment, under the assumption that this environment supports the underlying technology. To be fair, VMware has gained some good efforts with NSX maturity, so the awareness has grown. What is pretty much unknown, as I've learned, is that ADC has been part of that game for a while. And it's a specialized scenario, but in case you are there, it will look like this. You have your existing site, cloud-wise or premises-wise, or in whatever location that is, and under the assumption that the technology allows you applying this type of transport, you can span the existing network to another compute site using the same IP scheme, so it's layer 2 transparency. So moving servers forth and back is way easier if you don't have routing boundaries. There's no new DNS names, there's no routing specialization. It's just as these servers were part of your original network, and that way you can easier have some specialized compute options moved out of your asset in some cloud offering, while still maintaining all the interdependency of all these services. And what you also can do is you can expand this into any other NSXV compliant endpoint as well. So that's the way how network virtualization can also work. Interestingly, there has not been made much buzz around the feature because it's there in ADC for a while, and it is less often used. But if you have these specialized requirements and the environment and the CSP that you're working with allows you to do so, this has a great power. Just rethink that over for certain specialized scenarios. With that, I want to close down on the infrastructure and move to identity. Identity is a hard thing, and we need to start with Azure AD, as this, I was saying earlier on, is the most relevant identity play that we have in the market space in terms of when you are in a Microsoft shop, you can't get out of that, right? So starting with the Azure AD integration, it's just that little directory that has some power in terms of authenticating services. And when Microsoft now starts building solutions on top of Azure AD as an infrastructure solution, there is technically no way around the so-called Azure Application Proxy. That's the way how the story starts like. That's their way of you bringing web services and RDP services into an Azure world and integrating them with their authentication system. So it's fair to say that they provide you with kind of a lightweight ADC reverse proxy technology that can do at least the job for this specialized purpose. And it's very minimalistic, which has advantages because of a simple learning curve, but it doesn't exceed that minimalistic configuration approach as it is. And the thing is, as Microsoft now pushes AAP forward extensively, that's really something that happens in customer environments heavily, what does it mean to the traditional approach of publishing services using traditional ADC footprints? The marketing terminology tells you there is no more need for third-party ADC appliances if you go AAP, right? That's often heard there. And that absolutely also means any ADC that you replace has an equal counterpart with an AAP, right? There is no footprint behavior change. It's just swapping out an existing technology with another one. So there's nothing rocket science, and they need a component there. And what I also like in that debate is that I would say marketing flashover that's saying, hey, it's the end of DMZ needs. Let's have a picture with that. This is the way it looks like if it's deployed in an HA manner. So if you're Azure Network tenant, you have at least 2 proxies per site that are available to connect your web services to the outside world. And that's the way how you're going to provide authenticated services to your users, assuming that you migrated your environment in a state where Azure AD provides authentication to any user. And it's just working. For sure, these application proxies must be domain members to provide your single sign-on capabilities to Windows backends. Otherwise, all these KCD things never will lift off. So it is a domain-joined machine per se. And from a flow perspective, you just have a checkbox and saying, I want these traffic to be authenticated to Azure AD. It's a pretty simple checkbox feature, and you're good to go. So it looks attractive, no doubt. So the user goes to Azure, comes back through the application proxy, and has access to your infrastructure. What's interesting at that point is the simplification about this no DMZ thing. The traffic that comes to the inside technically is nothing else than an ingress VPN connection, because logically, or speaking technically, you have an outbound connection from the AAP to Azure Cloud. That's right, that's the firewall perspective. But this is a permanently maintained connection that is ready to take incoming traffic. This is nothing else than services publishing the traditional way. It is more sandbox style. It is less obvious what's happening under the covers, but it is nothing else than incoming traffic from Azure Network. And Microsoft has to take care that only the good guys take down that road. So assuming that something goes wrong on the Azure portion, I don't know what's maybe happening there. If somebody finds a way to take the route downwards to any customer's AAP without being stopped by any local DMZ type of setup. That's the reason why in that diagram the AAP sits shielded in between firewalls, so that you have a restriction not only on the outbound tier, but also on the inbound tier, which systems you want to actually publish using that mechanism. So it's fair to say, if that's the technology, let's bring back, just to add, and I forgot to say that, it doesn't even contain LB functionalities. So AAP also assumes that the services themselves are HA per se, which is a Microsoft play, which is okay. But now seeing that picture and saying, okay, we don't even know the healthiness there. So if something just breaks, you will find out when the user clicks the resource and the AAP then says, oh, sorry, there's a gateway timeout, I can't reach the application. This is way less quality and way less monitoring capability than we had previously when the same position in DMZ was occupied by traditional ADC. So let's put an ADC back in here. If the ADC is in here and the requirement is that Azure AD is the de facto authentication standard, let's go for that. The Citrix ADC still has a domain account functionality to have the KCD to the backend. Still the same functionality. So Citrix can do that KCD for a while. And of course, you can make this AAA system ready to have Azure authentication capability so that the user even doesn't know the difference. There's actually nothing the user can observe if you replace AAP with ADC, vice versa. It's just the same functionality. So the only difference that it actually does, it is that the traffic now comes back to you directly. So it comes back to you directly either to your on-prem DMZ, or it comes back to you directly in your cloud DMZ where you place the ADC instead. So that's the only real technical difference, that you make that more visible again, that traffic hits you directly. But all the remaining components are just the same as before. So it should be good to go. And that's why I would say, because of the better health check capabilities, it is more favorable. And what's also important to notice, as it is a Citrix ADC, it's not only for web technology. It's not only for RDP technology. It's also applicable if you need to publish an existing virtual apps and desktops on-prem towards Azure AD authentication. So assuming that you're not already in WorkSpace, but still maintain the more traditional way of hosting HDX, VDAs, and the requirement from businesses to say, okay, starting tomorrow, everybody in the organization has to authenticate using Azure AD. You can use ADC to bring all these resources in exactly that play. So there is no functionality gap in there, and you can even do more. And plus, on top, you have a better quality and better services monitoring with that. What's interesting, and that's also shocking to me, if you compare the quality of what the services now have, left-hand side looks pretty much okay. It's not A+, I see that yourself, but look at the details. If you compare the Microsoft offering towards an ADC, it is getting orange. It's not getting orange since last week, it's getting orange for a few months already. So if you think that Qualys is pretty much good in analyzing and testifying what SSL readiness and which encryption standards your solutions have, the Microsoft is really lagging behind, because they try to be compatible to any client on the planet, including XP, if you will. Whereas on the ADC tier, you can decide on what the level is. And what's more shocking to me, that's not even configurable. It's just as it is. If you have an existing AAP in your environment, point Qualys to there, you get exactly that result, and you can't go beyond that point. So if it's Qualys saying something has a weak cipher, I'll really think about the security pattern that your infrastructure has. The other point is the authentication to Azure AD itself. As I was saying, Azure AD is required for any O365 journey that you have, so Teams, Hybrid Exchange, OneDrive, the apps, regardless if it's Windows or it's an iPhone, an Android, whatever, it requires authentication, right? And if you look at authentication needs, there's obviously the chance that you are good with giving Microsoft your credentials. If I work with customers, the majority of them complains that the last thing I want to do is giving marks of my credentials, right? So the reason why they do not do that password hash copy with AD Connect. And the same applies to the pass-through authentication myth, which is sometimes promoted as Microsoft doesn't have your password, but technically you provide the password into a Microsoft infrastructure for sending that back to your premises or cloud environment to actually validate the password. So what it ends up in is federated authentication. So the whole ADFS story is just part of the game. You can't do an enterprise Azure AD authentication strategy without having ADFS in place, kind of. And this also requires you rethinking your multi-factor strategy, right? You may have existing solutions. If they are not 100% compatible to run on top of ADFS infrastructure, you're screwed. It needs to be some of the next generation type of multi-factor solution to get that gameplay in a good shape. And it's regardless if you still run it on-prem or if you move these ADFS web infrastructure into a cloud site, it's still the underlying technology that is required, and it requires a bunch of functionalities. So from a diagramming perspective, so either on-prem or cloud-wise, you have these two zones, where the one zone supports your internal users, and the DNZ zone supports your external users. So the internals go the short way across an LB that you have to provide, and the external guys go through the LB across the web and go this way. The interesting thing from an architectural perspective is that the MFA entitlement to get strong authentication for outside users technically lives on the inside machine. So the web is just a reverse proxy functionality to differentiate that it's coming from the outside, but the logical binary that does multi-factor authentication has to live inside of the ADFS framework. And if you have something that is older, or something that you created over the course of time yourselves using engineering efforts, and it doesn't comply with that, you're screwed. So rethink the picture. If we move out as much as possible and just retain the ADFS, it's actually like this. So backwards and forwards. You can rip off practically everything Microsoft except for the ADFS itself and get the exact same functionality. So that means internal users use the same way as before, whereas the external guys now hit you in the same manner as they, for example, do on your HDX place. So they even recognize the existing authentication dialogues, so they feel familiar with the UI, which is also important if you talk about enterprise customers and you have to train hundreds and thousands of users, that you have new front door authentication masks that are now appropriate to type passwords inside. That's something costly. If you retain the existing UI, that's way easier in terms of user adoption and quality. And what's also important, using that approach, any existing MFA that you have today continues to work. There's nothing that you need to take care of, because technically on the ADFS side, there is no MFA requirement for that. You can offload, if you will, that in front of an ADC, and you can have an EPA functionality. If you want to scan those machines for certain other requirements, you can do that as well. And it's the exact same functionality. The footprint that you actually need there is pretty much low. It's just a single HA parent that can do all the stuff. So if you know about how to partition NetScalers into different zones, you really can do a very minimalistic approach of doing a great ADFS front-end authentication. And what's important, that's why I'm saying there's an update in there. Technically, now the NetScaler has been made ready to actually support WSFET support. There's a different handshaking mechanism that requires certain engine changes. What's also important, and if you compare that to the WAP experience that you have today, that pre-filling of the username in the input box is now also possible, so the user just has to type password and MFA, and all the rest just comes down from the Azure footprint. So technically, we have this ADFS PIP level reached, at least for the user password scenarios, so user password plus some multi-factor. This is all compliant ADFS PIP, so there's no compatibility worries that you have to go through. And the next-gen ADFS PIP is underway. So in a few, I would say, weeks or at least months from now, we have the full feature set. You're really safe to go there as a full ADFS proxy replacement, so that WAP can go all the way. And that's way simpler footprint, I would say. Finally, the last candidate, it's Citrix WORKSPACE. And that's really a monster in terms of discussing identity. And the reason is pretty simple. Citrix WORKSPACE is a SaaS offering. It lives outside of your own boundaries, right? Hello there. OK, here we go. So we talk about the login for your users towards their workspace. They log into an offering that is obviously located on the outside of your existing IT environment. where internal users may want to access internal resources and have to undergo an authentication mechanism. At the same time, also outside users go to the same place, also accessing those internal resources. So this is a traditional question of bringing up, okay, who authenticates in what quality, what's the minimum level of authentication need that you have there? And you don't want to have everybody typing just use a password there, right? If you're promoting your VDAs throughout Workspace, so if you have CVAT, use it there and let's, for example, allow a desktop access or allow access to your BI system or whatever, the last thing you want to have there is a weak authentication pattern, right? So what can you do there? That's one of the reasons why Citrix has brought up an integrated multi-factor solution play. So it's the own SSO app that you can use to enrich the authentication strength there. But this is a new product. For your users, it is a new enrollment into a new technology. If you have something existing, other MFA in place, that's not respected. That's just the way it is, but you may want that. And you also may want to have the ability to bring your identity control completely back in your hands. You want to federate against that environment. You may want to have something where you don't even have to type passwords, where you want to have strong factors like fingerprints, smart cards, stuff like that, but you don't want to have users to deal with passwords. And that's all the way that Citrix Cloud is not built by design, but it is configurable. So it's the default design. You have users coming from the inside and the outside, typing their credentials there. The credentials are then being sent over across the connector for Active Directory validation. And if that feels ugly to you, you implement the Citrix MFA on top so that typing requires an additional criteria to have strong authentication. Unfortunately, that also applies to internal users then. There's no differentiation. It's just a service that says, I have strong authentication enabled. I want to go that way. That's not making everybody lucky. So the next best approach to there is saying, OK, I want to link my existing workspace into Azure AD. As the majority of HDX customers likely will have some sort of Azure AD entitlement, why not? So you make Citrix Workspace an app inside Azure AD and have users authenticate there. This moves the requirement of a good authentication towards Azure AD. With the previous chapters about how you can authenticate to Azure AD, that's some of the gameplay that you can go for. So you have a differentiation between internal and external users because of the way how you design Azure AD authentication. But it leaves behind one single element that users in the very first phase have to specify their name before authentication even starts, because Azure AD has no clue about your tenant. You need to type the name, right? So this is not the ultimate best play. And even if you have MFA there, it's still not 100% comfortable. That's why I'm saying we have something new. What you can now do is bring your existing or a dedicated ADC in play that has an awareness about internal clients that, for example, speaks Kerberos, so silent authentication. It has a good awareness of how to authenticate external users with any type of external MFA, whatever. And by this way, you now have an OpenID relationship, OpenID Connect relationship between Citrix Workspace and your environment, which requires an update on your Workspace tenant and requires a new specialized firmware on your premises or cloud end that these guys speak together. And with that, you have the ability that internal users have a silent login, whereas external users have the full-blown MFA, EPA, even passwordless, whatever login capability. And by that, you have a very user-compatible version of bringing users into Workspace seamlessly. It's tech preview. That's about to end quickly. So it's the last thing that I've heard is like Q3. Then it's going out into final word. And I want to showcase you what it looks like. That's pretty easy. First, I start with my existing client that is not enabled for federation yet. So I go to my cloud workspace and type in my credentials in the same way as I would do before that feature even existed. So I type user, name, and credential. This is checked towards my Active Directory. And it doesn't matter if it's an external or internal client. It's the same for everybody. I get my resources, all this is done. So that's the undesired way, right? So from there, I switch off to my administration control panel. So the screen switches to red. This is my administration perspective. I go into my Citrix Workspace account, go into identities. As this requires some sort of preparation, I already obviously configured the AAA enforcement and the pairing. So it's available as a configured option right now. And then you go into your workspace and say, this is the new default that I want my users to use for authenticating to Workspace. After you commit that, it takes approximately 10 minutes of downtime before your service is available back in public. That's some reconfiguration that is done underneath. And from there, when you access the service, it requires OpenID federation with your infrastructure that you have brought into that configuration. So I have a client with 2 network cards. It is now joined to a domain network. Open the browser, type the exact same URL, and you will see some flipping, but you won't see any interactivity except for taking me directly into my workplace, because Kerberos authentication negotiate just happens. So here's my resources. Same obviously applies to the WORKSPACE app. It will also fade in an external browser window after typing the FQDN, because it doesn't know that it's getting seamless. It technically may type something, but it's ending faster, so you see it opening and closing. In the background, the Kerberos is done. Takes me to my WORKSPACE config on the native app as well. So far, so good. So we now sanitize the environment. So I'm deleting the account in the WORKSPACE app. I'm logging out from the browser. The browser, by the way, now says goodbye on my ADC tier, so the exit message now comes from you. The previous one was sent from the cloud. This is your own one right now. And we move that client now into a DSL hotspot zone. So it's like being located as a road warrior somewhere else. You see firewall switches to private network mode. Now I don't have any more direct access to my domain network anymore, so I'm underway. Here you go. Opening the browser back. Has the same logic inside, but it's now getting picked by the ADC that sees that I'm coming from the outside and goes through the standard authentication dialog that you are willing to present the user with. So like user, password, MFA, smart card, whatever other sort of identity play you want to get there, authenticate, and it takes you to the WORKSPACE, sorry. Here's the stuff. And obviously, same proof for the native app. Brings up the embedded browser, brings up the authentication. Next, 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 shows you the app. And this is important in many places because, for example, if you previously just had the Azure AD option in Citrix WORKSPACE, that implies that any user is enrolled against Azure AD. That's the first limitation that may be a little bit earlier for your audience. Second thing is, these ergonomic things is maybe problematic. You may have different authentication needs in Azure AD than you have for your HDX WORKSPACE needs. Now you can separate these 2 things. And what's also important, if there is something in terms of an authentication need that does not fit into the Azure AD world today, you can take now ADC as a bridgehead device to integrate whatever you like. So it's not necessarily required that ADC has the UI for the login. If you've got some other identity provider like Google Ping or whatever that has not a direct counterpart with your WORKSPACE strategy or not direct counterpart with your Azure AD strategy, you can use that ADC as kind of a silent bridgehead of mentoring the request from the cloud towards any other identity resource and just making it happen that users get there in the right place. So if you did count my 6 chapters, I should be ending, but I have one more thing in the tradition of Synergy. So my 7th one is a flavor that I still think has become certain kind of important, because if we move our resources outside of our environment and put them in somewhere cloud, it's still heavily important that users have a clue how to get there. And you want to minimize the number of authentication dialogues the user is faced with, right? So if you think about your domain-joined computers, I think you have all a massive laptop workforce underway that need access to your environment. I think the old-fashioned VPN thing is still alive and still a very applicable technology to bring users back into your environment without nagging them about the underlying technology. So VPN is there for a while. Even VPN on ADC is nothing new. What is new, however, is the flavor that if you know about what direct access has been a while, and you know that direct access has ended on the Microsoft end, that Citrix ADC can now take over any existing direct access philosophy of operating a roaming device being always connected to your environment once it has an interconnection. With no user interactivity, with silent authentication, so certificate-wise, the device gets a connection to your data center, to your ADC endpoint, and from there you have all the resources required. And that also applies to the pre-login phase, which is the important one. You give out a laptop to a user, which, for example, needs to change the password. before authentication, you know, this change on next login checkbox, with a VPN that is established even before the login phase, that's very powerful. And so that's the latest add to that zoo. With that, takeaways, I think cloud transformation is not that easy. You need to rethink all the puzzle pieces, how they mix up together. What is an application? What is a service? What requires authentication? What is the best place to do authentication? How many authentication prompts a user actually requires? And if you go through all these questions, you will see that ADC is kind of the bridgehead component that ties all these things back together. And so I think at least for the next 3 to 5 years, cloud transformation will be very interesting because ADC puts this all back together. And so the total is better than the individuals. So this is my puzzle I would like to offer in favor of the time, which ends practically right now. We are ending that here. So before you go out, please take the app and vote for the session and give the feedback here. I need that absolutely for eventually coming back next year. And saying thank you for that. The download will start as it is announced. I will put the long presentation deck in there instead of the short that you have seen here. So if you go through recording, go backwards and see the page is not moving incrementally. There is something left out that is back in the deck that will upload there. And with that, there's some more ADC stuff around during the rest of Synergy. And with that, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the time. Bye-bye. We're done.